finish before. Perfect. All right. Jeremy, you hear me all right? All right, Chavra on Zoom, you still hear me all right? All right, excellent.
You can hear me, but we can't hear you. We need to select the speaker. Sound button.
All right, Rabbi, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. So first of all, it is an incredible zechus to be here with all of you. Baruch Hashem, here physically here in Toronto, and Baruch Hashem, I see my chevra back in Baltimore as well. A great zechus to Baruch Hashem be back with everyone. It's three worlds here. We're here physically in Toronto, chevra in the base medrash in Baltimore. Then there's Zoom. And I still have to focus on Yevamos. So, all right, so Meretz Hashem, a lot to do today. So today's daf is daf Zayin. And in Meretz Hashem, we are picking up on Vav Amud Beis 6b. And we're picking up in Meretz Hashem 3 lines up from the bottom, Aharon Yosef Bar Ashi. So just to give a little bit of context. Remember again on daf Gimel Amud Beis, the Gemara said that the entire essence of this sugya, already beginning from the Mishnah, which outlined a very simple concept, which is that although there is a mitzvah of yibum, but if the sister-in-law is an erva to the surviving brother, so yibum cannot be performed. And not only that, but if the sister-in-law is an erva, she not only doesn't do yibum, but she precludes her tzara, her co-wife, and the tsaras tzara, the co-wife of the co-wife, from doing yibum. And the Gemara explained that ultimately all of this is learned out from achos ishto, one's wife's sister. Again, I'm not going to go through the whole Gemara now, but essentially what it comes down to is as follows. We know that a person is not permitted to marry his wife's sister, okay? There is an extra word in that pasuk of aleha. The Gemara uses that extra word, aleha, to create a gzeira shava between achos ishto, one's wife's sister, and yibum, to teach us that although there is a mitzvah of yibum, if halacha lamaisa, the yevama, is one's wife's sister. For example, 2 brothers married 2 sisters. So now let's say Reuven passes away. Shimon now is the surviving brother. So now Reuven's widow also happens to be Shimon's sister-in-law. Halacha lamaisa, she's not a sister-in-law. His wife's sister, also a sister-in-law. His wife's sister, halacha lamaisa, he is not permitted to go ahead and do yibum. Okay, so I will say, so that what the Gemara is trying to figure out is as follows. The fact that we need that drasha tells us that if I didn't have that drasha, I would have thought what? That yibum would be permitted even in a situation of a significant erva. That's what I would have thought. Because remember again, if I wouldn't have thought it would have been mutter, I wouldn't have needed the drasha. The fact that I need the drasha tells you that otherwise I thought it would have been mutter. So I will say, the Gemara is just trying, and this was all of yesterday's daf, I'll also continue today's daf, which is, why would I have assumed that's mutter? Why would I have assumed that performing yibum with a major erva would have been permitted? So we're trying to just find examples, another situation in which, again, such a scenario, or essentially aseh doche lo saseh, even by a significant lo saseh, would have been permitted. That's the entire exercise over here. So let's go back to it. Says the Gemara. Aharon Yosef Bar Ashi. So Yosef Bar Ashi says as follows. Aharon Yosef Bar Ashi, Hai Tana lo mishum da asi aseh v'dachi lo saseh. Now the truth is, again, Yosef Bar Ashi is bringing up over here by Shabbos, right? Remember again the Torah in yesterday's daf, we had the fascinating drasha lo seva'aru eish b'chol moshvosechem b'yom Shabbos. The Gemara wanted to know, why do I need b'chol moshvosechem? The Gemara wanted to suggest that what? That even Beis Din, who's obligated to go ahead and execute someone, would not execute someone on Shabbos. It's an aseh, it's a positive commandment for Beis Din to carry out an execution once someone has been condemned, and there's a lo saseh of Shabbos, and I might have thought that the aseh of execution overrides the lo saseh of Shabbos. Chomosh Osechem says it doesn't. Says the Gemara, the truth is, it has nothing to do with aseh doche lo saseh. Rather what? Elo mishum damaisi mekavachomer. We'll see, here's what's interesting. There's a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Second line up from the bottom. Daf vav amud beis. Bachi kamar. Ma'ani mekayim mechalaleha mos yumas. What does it mean when the pasuk says those who desecrate the Torah, at least certain mitzvahs of the Torah, shall be put to death? So the Gemara says, Bishar malachos chutz mimisas bezdin. Then I will say, here's what's interesting. That tells me generally, I'm not allowed to violate Shabbos. In a general sense, I'm not permitted to violate Shabbos. But halacha l'maisa, perhaps, when Bezdin has an obligation to carry out the death penalty, perhaps that can be done on Shabbos. Bishar malachos chutz mimisas bezdin. Aval misas bezdin, Dachya Shabbos mikal v'chomer. So I will say, I might have thought that the obligation of Bezdin to execute someone sets aside the laws of Shabbos. In other words, so I will say it's not as much an asay docha lo saseh as much as it is a kal v'chomer. I might have thought that Bezdin is permitted to execute someone. And I also remember again, execution itself is a malacha. Depending on the nature of the execution, it could be more than one malacha. Right? We saw like in Sreifa. Sreifa would ultimately again be shchita and bishul. Okay, it's in havara. So the idea over here is, I would have thought, without b'chomosh osechem, that execution should be doche Shabbos from a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Zayin amud aleph, 7a, first line. We'll say here's the kal v'chomer. Uma avoda shichamura v'doche Shabbos. You're supposed to listen to this. Avoda, which means literally again avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, is doche Shabbos. I'm sorry. Avoda is chamura, and then it's doche Shabbos. So we know halacha l'maisa. We go ahead and we perform avoda on Shabbos, right? So remember again, Kohen does the avoda in the mikdash, even though avoda in the mikdash by definition has malacha involved. So avoda is chamur, that it's doche Shabbos. Ritzicha docha osa. We'll say this is a wild halacha. Ritzicha, murder, is docha avoda. Now what that literally means is not that ritzicha is docha, but rather punishment for murder is docha avoda. Sheleimah me'im mizbechi tika chana lavos. Let's talk about this in just a moment. Take a look at Rashi. Ritzicha docha osa shim hayirotzeach kohen v'rotze la'avod avoda. Let's say you have a kohen who murdered someone, and the kohen wants to do the avoda. He wants to perform temple service. So what do? Says Rashi, Sholchim umavin oso lamos. We go ahead and we take the kohen and we execute him. We don't let him do the avoda. Rather, we execute him. So the Gemara, umavin oso lamos. Ela imkein haya al gagoshal mizbeach va'avoda biyado. I will say now the one exception to this is something fascinating. So if a kohen murdered someone chas v'shalom and now he wants to do the avoda, we tell him, sorry, you can't do the avoda. You have other things to do, namely get executed. Right? We don't let him do the avoda. The exception to the rule is if he's already on the mizbeach doing the avoda, we let him finish. Shene Emar, because the pasuk says, Me'im mizbechi tikachana lamos. Now, Rabbi say it's interesting. The Gemara darshans Me'im mizbechi means from my mizbeach. The mashmos, the inference from that is if he's al mizbechi. If he's on the Mizbeach, ultimately, again, we don't interrupt that. We let him finish the avoda, and after he finishes the avoda, then we execute him. So, right? So, just follow this kal v'chomer. So, avoda, which is chomer, right? Avoda in the Beis Hamikdash, which is chomer, so chomer that it's doche Shabbos. Yet, again, punishment for capital punishment is doche avoda, right? That if a kohen wanted to do the avoda, but chas v'shalom is liable to a death penalty, ultimately, again, avoda is set aside in order to go ahead and punish the kohen. Now watch this. Shabbos, shenitches mipnei avoda. Then Shabbos, which is set aside because of avoda, because of service in the Beis Hamikdash, eino din shetei ritzicha docha osa. Ultimately, again, certainly, capital punishment should set aside Shabbos. We'll say that's the kal v'chomer. If avoda, which is chomer, is docha Shabbos, and capital punishment is docha avoda, then ultimately Shabbos, which is set aside because of avoda, should certainly be set aside because of capital punishment. Namely, that you can administer capital punishment on Shabbos. That's the havamina. Therefore, the Gemara says, nothing to do with asay docha lo asay. It's kal v'chomer. And therefore, what happens? Let's just close out the circle. Therefore, what happens? The Torah says, no, lo seva'aru eish b'chol moshvoseichem b'yom HaShabbos. And moshvoseichem actually doesn't mean homes. What does moshvoseichem mean? That we saw in yesterday's daf. Bezdin. So therefore, the pasuk teaches me that although it's a great kal v'chomer, halacha l'maisa, we don't administer capital punishment on Shabbos. Incredible. So I'll just mention, by the way, if you think about it, it's just like Al Divrei Hashkafa. I was very, I had the great zechus to repair the daf in Mel's home last night. I think it was the Ram Siyata Dishmaya that I was thinking about this. What a strange halacha. What a strange halacha. Can you imagine this? So we darshan based on the fact, me'im mizbechi tikachan alamos, which means if the coin is next to the mizbeach, ultimately, again, we can go ahead and take him for execution. But if he's on the mizbeach, literally, like if he's doing the avoda, we don't interrupt him, we let him finish, then we take him. I thought about this, like, that's crazy. The guy's a murderer, right? The Kohen who's doing the avoda committed a murder. He's on the mizbeach doing the avoda, it's very nice, but lamaisi, he committed murder. So the Gemara says, just let him finish. Let him finish. What do you mean let him finish? Pull him, yank him off there. What are you talking about? The guy committed murder. You're going to let him finish the avoda, yank him off. I don't care what he's doing. I don't care if it's the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Yank him out. Pull him out and administer the punishment. Elamai, what do you see? You see the power of a Yid when he's performing a mitzvah. You see at the end of the day, we all have profound imperfections, right? And we all do many, many, many things wrong. That's just the nature of being a human being. But in the moment when a Jew is performing a mitzvah, there is nothing holier. In the moment when a Jew is doing avodas hakodesh, in that moment, here you see this Kohen, and this is a profoundly flawed individual. After all, again, he murdered, right? And it's not a metaphor, by the way, that he murdered, right? Not that he murdered his potential, he murdered his possibilities, right? We're talking about a guy who killed someone. But lemaisa, when he is in the middle of performing that avodah, when he is in the middle of performing that mitzvah, the Torah says, just let him finish. Just let him finish. Because when a Jew performs a mitzvah, no matter how flawed I may be in the grand totality of life, a mitzvah almost represents an island of spiritual perfection. In that moment, I'm doing what I need to be doing. In that moment, I'm the person I really need to be. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, just let him finish. What's going to come is going to come, right? The punishment is going to come. But in that moment, just let him finish. And I will say, what a profound lesson for us also. Because the truth is, a lot of times, kind of going back to last night's show, so many times we focus on our imperfections and we focus on what's wrong and we focus on what's broken. But we always have to remember that although there are many things that are misfiring in my personal life, when I'm performing a mitzvah, in that freeze frame, in that moment, it's perfect. In that moment, it's great. And in that moment when HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks at me, all he sees is the spiritual beauty of my Maisa mitzvah. Let's go back there. Says the Gemara, Umay o ena de kamar. So remember again, this is hearkening back a lot to yesterday's daf. So remember again, there was a lot of back and forth in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, what was the other side? What was the other side of this argument? Umay o ena de kamar. Haki kamar. Kvuras meis mitzvah tochiach. So we'll say, what's the pushback against the Kal V'chomer? The pushback against the Kal V'chomer is as follows. What about meis mitzvah? Listen to this, because meis mitzvah, we'll say, remember again, what's meis mitzvah? You find an unattended corpse, right? You find chas v'shalom, person who died, no one is there to go ahead and take care of the burial. Such a person is a meis mitzvah. So we'll say, listen to this. The Gemara says you could prove that what we said before is untrue from meis mitzvah. Oh, what's the pshat of the meis mitzvah? So here we go. Shedoches avoda. Remember, meis mitzvah is docha avoda, right? Because at the end of the day, if a Kohen is on his way to do the avoda, and he sees a meis mitzvah, what's the halacha? Take care of the meis mitzvah. And I will say, what's the chiddush in that? What's the chiddush in that of taking care of the meis mitzvah? Even though what's going to happen when he takes care of the meis mitzvah? What by definition occurs? Can't do the avoda, right? Because now he's going to be tamei. So meis mitzvah's docha avoda, ve'ein dochas haShabbos. Yet I will say, here's what's interesting. Meis mitzvah is not docha Shabbos, right? You're on your way to shul on Shabbos, and you go ahead and you see a meis mitzvah. What do you do? Nothing, right? You could cover the mace. In fact, there's a whole discussion in Machlokes, by the way, if you're allowed to cover the mace either, because there's a whole discussion in Hilchos Muktzah about whether or not you're permitted to go ahead and move a utensil to serve a muktzah item. Again, so we would pass that you cover the mace, but you don't do anything. So mace mitzvah is docha avoda and not docha Shabbos. So the Gemara says, therefore you see things. Just so in other words, the whole previous Kal V'chomer was built on the fact that if you're docha avoda, you're certainly docha Shabbos. Right? Remember again, so we said before, if administering capital punishment is docha avoda, it's certainly docha Shabbos. Which the Gemara says, Now, the pushback to that is that Kal V'chomer is flawed, because there are things that are docha avoda that are not docha Shabbos, i.e. meis mitzvah. So the Gemara says, Hadar Amar, then we go ahead and we say, Kvuras meis mitzvah tidcha Shabbos mikal v'chomer. But again, on the flip side, right, so the pushback to the pushback would be that Kvuras meis mitzvah, burying a meis mitzvah, should be docha Shabbos mikal v'chomer. Based on the Kal V'chomer, what's the Kal V'chomer? Uma avoda shi docha Shabbos. Avoda is docha Shabbos. Kvuras meis mitzvah docha osa. Remember, so avoda is docha Shabbos, and remember, meis mitzvah is docha avoda. We know that. So the Gemara mila achoso. That's learned out from the pasuk of ula lo aviv uli imo lo achiv ula achoso lo yitame lahem. So also remember again talking about the people you cannot become tummy for. But the Gemara darshans over by the Kohen Gadol that although he cannot become tummy for his mother, his father, and his sister, he can become tummy ultimately again for a meis mitzvah. So you see over here, avoda is docha Shabbos, and meis mitzvah is docha avoda. Shabbos shenitcha mipnei avoda. Eino din should take vuras meis mitzvah docha osa. So therefore again Shabbos, which is nitcha because of avoda, certainly again meis mitzvah should set aside Shabbos. TALMUD lomar lo sivaru eish. Therefore, both say the Torah comes along and says lo sivaru eish b'chomosh osechem, which teaches us ultimately that Shabbos is not set aside. Fine. Ulamai desalak adaite meikara the asiyase v'dachi lo asase. So both say. So now here's what's interesting. So let's just kind of bring this all together. You know, we'll say, what's fascinating about these sugyas, maybe a little bit challenging also, is if you notice, like, there's no break in the sugya, right? In other words, the sugya is continuous. So every once in a while, it's helpful just to go back and refocus. Remember again, here's what we have. In yesterday's daf, towards the end of yesterday's daf, we had the drush of lo sivaro ish b'chomosh osechem b'yom HaShabbos. We thought that was a sugya of asay doche lo saseh. What the Gemara just did now is said, no, that's not asay doche lo saseh. It's actually what? Kal V'chomer. Kal V'chomer. So we'll say now, okay, so now the Gemara is going back and saying, but when we originally thought that it was a sugya of asay doche lo saseh, let's go back and revisit that. Ulamai desalak adaite meikara. That which we thought from the beginning. That which we thought from the beginning. The asi asay v'dachi lo saseh. That a positive commandment could come along and set aside a prohibition. That's what we thought originally. That ultimately the Torah was coming to tell us what? That you could administer capital punishment on Shabbos. Then Rabbi say, how could you administer capital punishment on Shabbos? Administering capital punishment is a malacha. What's the answer? Asay docha lo saseh. That the positive commandment of ultimately administering capital punishment is docha the lo saseh of violating Shabbos. So that, we're going back to our original mindset. That which we thought originally that asay docha lo saseh, my oeno dika'amar. Rabbi say, what was the pushback to that? Hachi kamar. Here's the pushback. Ma'ani mekayim mechalaleha mos yumas. So Rabbi say, in general, I thought when the Torah says that one is put to death for violating Shabbos, what is that referring to? Bishar melachas chutz mimisas bezdin. That's referring to other malachas. In other words, people say all other malachas, but it's not referring to when Bezdin has to execute someone. Chutz mimisas bezdin. Aval misas bezdin dachi Shabbos. But I would have thought that the ability for Bezdin to execute someone is permitted, right? And that should be docha Shabbos. Why? The asiyah say v'dachi lo saseh. Because Rabbi say halacha l'maaseh is very simple. I would assume that the asay is docha the lo saseh. The asay of executing someone is docha the lo saseh of Shabbos. So the Gemara says hadar amar, but then the pushback to that was Amar da'aminan da'asiyah say v'dachi lo saseh greda. See, Rabbi say this goes back to the original sugya. I would have thought, Rabbi say, everyone is okay. Pretty much everyone is okay with the concept of asay docha lo saseh when it's what we'll call an ordinary lo saseh. Right, so I'll say, what's a good example of an ordinary lo saseh? Good example, best example. Right? The example the Gemara started with. Right? What was the example the Gemara started with? Tzitzis and shatnez. That's a nice, calm asay docha lo saseh. Right? We have an asay, positive commandment, a lo saseh, which is essentially a lav. It's a prohibition, right? What happens if you go out and you wear shatnez? Right? You get malchus, not minimizing it, chas v'shalom, but l'maaseh it's a lav. So the Gemara says, I would have thought that when they say asay docha lo saseh, that's with the lo saseh greda. Right? Literally, again, just a regular lo saseh. But lo saseh sheyesh bo kares mishamis leididachi. I will say, but to make the jump and to say that asay doche lo saseh, ultimately again, even by a lo saseh that has kares, that's very strong. That's very strong. To which the Gemara says, mishamis leididachi. Hadr Amar Atu Asay Doches Lo Saseh. So we'll say, so then the pushback again. So what we're doing now is we're just going through all the different layers of the argument. So Hadr Amar, the pushback to that was Atu Asay Doches Lo Saseh Lav Lo Saseh Chamer Minei Vikaasi Asay V'Dachile. So we'll say, so let's think about this just a moment. So we'll say the whole notion of an asay doche lo saseh. We'll say which is stronger, an asay or a lo saseh? Which is stronger? Which is stronger? A lo saseh. Right? Remember again, if a person doesn't perform an asay, what's the repercussions of not performing an asay? None. You lose. In other words, a simple example, right? I don't take lulav and esrog. I don't take lulav and esrog. So what's the net effect? I've lost a mitzvah, which again is incredibly profound, but we'll call it on a punitive level. On a punitive level, it's minor, right? Or I should say, it's nothing on a punitive level, right? So listen to this. So it's just so fascinating. So the Gemara wants to say like this: even if I subscribe to asay doche lo saseh, I would say that only applies in what we call a low-level lo saseh, like a lav. But the ability of an asay to be doche lo saseh that has like a chi of misa, impossible. Why not? Take a look at the whole notion of the whole concept of asay doche lo saseh means a positive commandment, which again has no punitive repercussions. The notion that an asay can be doche lo saseh. I will say this is fascinating. By definition, every single lo saseh is what? More chomer than the asay. Right? That's just by definition. And yet you're telling me that an asay could trump it. Right? So therefore, again, the Gemara says, Ma li chumra zuta, ma li chumra rabba. Once you accept that framework, then halacha l'maisa, who cares if the asay is a lav or if it's a kares? In other words, we'll say it's so fascinating. If the concept works, the concept works. And if there's the ability of any asay to be docha lo saseh, then by definition, what does it matter if the lo saseh is a lav or the lo saseh is misa, the lo saseh is kares? Talmud lomar lo sivaru. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk comes along and says, lo sivaru. So we'll say, so therefore again, remember, all of that was a setup. What was it a setup for? Based on that logic, I would have said that halacha l'maisa, Beis Din should be permitted to go ahead and administer a death penalty on Shabbos based on the idea that the asay of execution or capital punishment is docha the lo sa'aseh of Shabbos. Kamash malon, the drasha, lo sivaru eish b'chol moshvosechem, the gzera shava, moshavos, that teaches us that Beis Din does not administer death penalties on Shabbos. So I will say, again, what's interesting to note is, and that kind of is going to close out the Shabbos sugya, what's interesting to note is, just based on a pure like aseh docha lo sa'aseh, we actually would have entertained the idea that Beis Din should administer death penalties on Shabbos. It's really only based on the fact that there's a gzera shava of moshavos that teaches me that Beis Din does not do so. So we'll say, which essentially says, we're back to square one. What's square one? Remember, square one is, I don't know, why do I need the drasha of aleha by achos ishto? So right, we're right back there again. In other words, I will say, so once again, the drasha of achos ishto teaches me that yibum is not permitted in a situation where there is a kares erva. Okay? The fact that I need that drasha tells me that without that drasha, I would have thought, asay doche lo saseh, even by an iser kares. Why would I have thought that? So we're right back there. Elo, it's trich. So I will say, I need to go ahead and exclude achos ishto from yibum. Why? Sakadai tchamina, listen to this. Tehevi hai eshesach davar shahaya bichlal, v'yotza min haklal. So we'll say, listen to this. There's another issue. I would have thought that the prohibition of brother's wife, right? Achos ishto, I'm sorry, eshes ach, I would have thought that the prohibition on my brother's wife was something shahaya bichlal, that was inside of the general rule. Now, both say, look at Rashi, almost right across. Shahaya bichlal, ki kol asher yaseh mikol hatoivos ha'ila v'nichresu. Both say the pasuk says, anyone who performs any of these abominable acts, this is the pasuk, the catch-all pasuk by arayos, by immoral relationships. So the pasuk says, anyone who commits any of these to'evos will experience kares. So Rashi says, b'chol ha'arayos kares, right? So kala b'chol ha'arayos kares. So we'll say, this is the pasuk, the catch-all pasuk for all forbidden relationships. So therefore we'll say, my brother's wife is included in that pasuk. The yatsa min haklal. Now we'll say, ultimately, so what happens? So now, brother's wife was taken out of the klal of kares. Now, when was brother's wife taken out of the klal of kares? When? By yibum, right? You also remember, the great chiddush of yibum is that there is a relationship. There is a relationship that was punishable by kares. And now is not only permitted, but what? Is a mitzvah. Which Rabbi said, by the way, I don't think I mentioned this before, but there's an incredible Musar Haskell on this also, which is that for a Jew, what's right and what's wrong is solely determined by the will of God. In other words, we'll say, right and wrong is not determined by what I feel is right and wrong. Or ultimately, again, what my hashkafas or my yediyas or my sensitivities, what's right and what's wrong is fundamentally dictated by the Ratzon Hashem. And which is why you could have a situation of Eshes Ach, a brother's wife, that is an Isser Kares, but yet again, in the case of Yibum, that very relationship becomes a mitzvah. It doesn't make any sense. If it's an Isser Kares, it's an Isser Kares. What do you mean now it's a mitzvah? So 5 minutes ago, it's an Isser Kares. Now the brother passes away, it's a mitzvah? Yeah, that is the way it works. Why? Because that which is right and that which is wrong is never based on human sensitivities or human feelings, because that's a dangerous thing. Because many terrible things have been committed throughout the ages because people thought that they were in the pursuit of some type of MS, some type of correctness, some type of rightness or righteousness. Our MS, our truth, our moral compass is fully and totally in the hands of the Ribbon Shalom. So the Gemara says, Eishes Ach, so my brother's wife was in the general klal of arayos. Then Yibum comes along and removes it and says this relationship is permitted under a certain context. V'yatza min haklal. So we'll say, now listen to this. So the v'yatza min haklal, l'lamed. And ultimately, again, when it's removed from the klal, from the general rule, it ultimately is removed in order to do what? In order to go ahead and teach me about that particular case, So, I'm sorry. V'yatza min haklal, l'lamed, lo l'lamed al atzmo yatza, ella l'lamed al haklal kulo yatza. So we'll say, let's talk about this for a moment, then we'll go back inside. The Gemara here is espousing an exegetical principle. And the principle is like this. When you have something that was included in a general rule, and then it was extracted from the general rule, the exegetical principle is, whatever applies to that extracted item, you can now apply back to the rule. That's the concept. Davar shahaya bichlal, something that was in the klal, the yatsa min haklal was pulled out from the klal. Lo l'lamed al atzmo yatsa, it wasn't just pulled out to learn about it, rather you pull it out in order to take that and then apply it to the general rule. The Gemara says this sign because we learned. Here it is. Davar shahaya bichlal, the yatsa min haklal, something that was included in the general rule and then extracted from the rule, wasn't only extracted to learn about the extracted item, but rather the extracted item is meant to what? Shed light on everything else inside of the klal. So Ketzad, the Gemara gives an example of this. Ketzad, v'nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim v'tumasu alav. So we'll say the Gemara quotes, the pasuk is as follows: v'nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim asher la'Hashem v'tumasu alav. A person who eats shlamim. Gemara is talking about over here, shlamim, person who goes in and eats shlamim, and he's in a state of ritual impurity. So what's the halacha? The halacha is v'nichrasa nefesh shahid. Unfortunately, again, kares. Person intentionally eats sacrificial items in a state of ritual impurity, ultimately kares. So Gemara says, v'halo shlamim bichlal kachim hayu. Now, here's what's interesting. Shlamim is included in the general statement of kachim. So why do you have to single out shlamim? Why do you single out shlamim? V'lama yatsu, why single out shlamim? Look at Rashi. Bichlal kol hakadshim hayu. Rashi says shekvar kalol karis bekulan kolish asher yikra mikol zarachem el hakadsh el hakadashim asher yakdishu. But also the Torah already said a general pasuk that said if you're in a state of ritual impurity, you cannot consume consecrated items, sacrificial items. So you already said it. So why do you have to say it again specifically by shlamim? So also here it is. You have a klal that says you can't eat karbanos in a state of ritual impurity. You pull out shlamim, and now you specifically articulate shlamim. Why are you bringing out shlamim? V'lama yatsu lahakish eleim v'lomar. So we'll say shlamim are being extracted, ultimately to compare the rest of karbanos to shlamim. To teach me what? Ma shlamim miyuchadim kadshe mizbeach. Just like shlamim are unique in that they are kadshe mizbeach. In other words, they're karbanos. They're karbanos. Af kol kadshe mizbeach. So to the punishment of kares applies to any karbanos that you eat in a state of ritual impurity. What does that come to exclude? Yatsu kadshe bedek habayis. But what does that come to exclude? Kadshe bedek habayis. Well, say kadshe bedek habayis just for our purposes means things that don't have physical sanctity, but rather only have monetary sanctity. So if you were to go ahead and consume something that is monetary sanctity, right, bedek habayis, you would not be chayiv karis. The chayiv karis only comes about for items that have physical sanctity, or we'll call ritual sanctity, or sacrificial sanctity. So we'll say, this is just an illustration, right? What do you have? You have a principle, a rule, right? A klal, a general principle. Then you have something specific pulled out of the principle. That teaches me a concept, and that concept then is applied back to the rest of the group, the rest of the klal. Now watch this. We'll say, this is incredible. So I would have thought the same thing over here. Hachanami, ha'eshesach bichlal kol harayos haisa. I will say, in general, my brother's wife is part of the general grouping of arayos. I will say, what's the punishment for arayos? Karis. Okay, now what happens? Eshes ach is pulled out. Then I will say, now why is Eshes ach pulled out from the grouping? For what purpose? To permit it where? By yibum. Watch this. I would have thought, v'lama yatzisa, lahakish eleh v'lomer lacha, ma Eshes ach sharya, Af kol arayos nami sharyon. Wow. I will say, this is incredible. I would have thought as follows. I have a klal. What's the klal? The klal says all arayos are punishable by kares. Who's included in the klal? Eshes ach, my brother's wife. Then something amazing happens. Eshes ach is pulled out of the klal by yibum. Right? And what does the Torah now tell me by yibum? That I'm not only permitted to marry my brother's wife, but what? It's a mitzvah. So now that you extracted that from the klal, learned the rule about the individual item, I assume, how does the exegetical principle work? Take the rule now and what? Apply it back to the klal, which nets what effect? All arayos are permitted for yibum. Wow. Now comes along the aleha from Eshes ach, ultimately from achos ishto, from my wife's sister to yibum that teaches me no. Not all arayos are permitted for yibum, but rather only one specific case of my brother's wife. But any other erva, for example, my wife's sister is not permitted for yibum. We'll say this is one of these moments where like the universe is in perfect equilibrium, right? Everything is perfect, everything is wonderful, everything now just fit into place. You almost don't want to go on to the next word because we're going to share it in just a moment. The Gemara goes right there. Where says, no, it's not good. Mi dummy, hasam klal bi'isser uprat bi'isser. She will say, it doesn't make sense. I'll tell you why. Because, for example, in the case of karbanos, the klal is an isser, right? Again, you can't eat karbanos ritual impurity, and the prat shlamim is also an isser. Hacha, they will say over here by yibum, klal be'isser. The klal is you can't engage in arayos, or forbidden relationships. Prat beheter. The truth is, remember again, my brother's wife is being pulled out of that group to permit something. So the comparison doesn't really work. Halo dami elul davar shahaya bichlal v'yatza ladun b'davar achadash. I will say the truth is, if you want to compare this to an exegetical principle, here's what it's compared to. It's compared to the following case. Something that was included in a general klal, in a general rule, and then what? V'yatza, then was pulled out of the klal, lidun b'davar achadash. And I will say it's pulled out in order to apply to it some type of chidush. some type of novel idea. And when you have a construct like this, a klal, and then something pulled out of the klal, and the item pulled out of the klal is subject to some chiddush, what do we say? I will say that's another fascinating exegetical principle. When you have a klal and you pull something out of the klal, and then a chiddishtic idea applies to the item extracted, you can't apply the chiddush back to the klal unless the Torah allows you to apply the chiddush back to the klal. Where do we see this? Tisanya, davar shaya bechlal, the yatsa ladun b'davar achadash. If you have an item that was included in the klal, in the general group, the yatsa lidun b'davar achadash, and now you extract one item from the general group in order to apply to it a chiddush, something unique. You cannot take that extracted item and apply it back, or put it back with the klal, put it back with the group, along with its chiddush, unless, of course, the Torah tells you to put it back into the klal. Okay, so the Gemara gives an example of this. What's a good example of this? So the Gemara says, "Keitzon v'shachat es hakeves b'makom asher yishchat es hachatas v'es ha'olah b'makom hakodesh ki kechatas ha'asham hu lakohen." So the pasuk says over here. This is talking about the asham of the mitzora, right? The person who has saras has to go through an entire purification process and also has a certain order of sacrifices, karbanos that he has to bring. So the Torah is speaking over here about the asham of the mitzora. So the Torah says that ultimately, again, his asham has to be like the chatas and like a chatas and a regular asham. Ki kechatas ha'ashamu. Shein tamud lomar kechatas ha'asham u'ma tamud lomar kechatas ha'asham. Why does the Torah have to compare the asham of the mitzora to a regular asham, a regular chatas? Lefi sheyatza asham mitzora lidon b'davar chadash. Because let's listen to this. The asham of a mitzora is a different type of carbon. What's unique about it? What's unique about the asham of the mitzora? Ultimately, again, bebohen yad ubohen regel. We'll say what's unique about it. There are blood applications, right? It's fascinating. You only have this by the mitzora. Blood applications of the asham. Where do you put it? On his right thumb and his right big toe, right? So this is unique. So the Gemara says, "B'davar hachadash bebohen yad ubohen regel yimanis locho yochol lo yehei ta'on matan dam ve'mur legab mizbeach." So I might have thought that since asham mitzora is so unique in that it requires the blood applications on his toe and on his thumb, I might have thought that therefore what? It doesn't require blood application and placement of limbs on the mizbeach. In other words, I would have thought. So we'll say, here's what's happening over here. It's an application of the principle. Asham mitzora was in the klal. Which klal? The klal of karbanos. What's halacha by karbanos? Karbanos have zrika, right? Blood applications and ultimately, again, placement of limbs on the mizbeach. So, and asham mitzora is included in that. But then what does the Torah do? The Torah pulls out asham mitzora from the klal of karbanos. How does the Torah pull out asham mitzora from the klal of karbanos? How does it do it? By telling you that asham mitzora is subject to something unique that other karbanos are not. Namely what? Blood applications on the thumbs and on the toes. Now, I would have thought once asham mitzora is pulled out from the klal of karbanos, that also means what? Maybe there's no blood applications on the mizbeach, and there's no placement of limbs. Amud beis. Therefore, the Torah says, Talmud lomar, top of Zayin Amud beis, Talmud lomar, ki kechatas ha'ashamu. Incredible. Therefore, we'll say, what does the Torah do? It says this is the illustration of the principle. The Torah says that the asham of the mitzora is just like any other chatas and asham. Or I should say, it's just like a chatas. Ki chatas ha'ashamu. The asham is going to be like the chatas. Namely what? Ma chatas tu'una matan damim. Just like a regular chatas requires blood applications. Ve'emurim legabi mizbeach. And you put the limbs on the mizbeach. Af asham ta'un matan damim ve'emurim legabi amizbeach. So too the asham requires blood applications and the placement of limbs on the mizbeach. And Abba say, now listen to this. Abba say, I just want to point out this is very exciting because what just happened over here, this is an illustration of another exegetical principle, which is when you have a klal, right? A klal, a rule, or really a grouping, and something is extracted from the grouping, okay? And now again, there is a chiddush in that extracted item. So ultimately, again, the only way to put that item back in the group is how? if the Torah tells you to put it back in the group. Otherwise, I wouldn't put it back in the group. What's the illustration of that? Let's just do this outside once more. Asher Mitzorah. What happens with Asher Mitzorah? The Asher Mitzorah is unique. So let's start. When we start with the Asher Mitzorah, it's part of Karbanos. Good, like any other Karban. Then it's pulled out. How is it pulled out? How is it pulled out? Right? Blood applications on the thumbs and on the big toes. That's how it's pulled out. Once it's pulled out, I say to myself, well, maybe it's pulled out for everything. And what would that mean? That would mean maybe Asher Mitzorah, it has blood applications on the thumbs and on the toes, but there's no blood applications where? On the Mizbeach, and no placement of lins on the Mizbeach. What does the Torah do? The Torah puts it back. How does the Torah put it back? With the phrase, Ki kechatas ha'asham. Torah puts it back into the rule. So watch this. V'ilo ahadrekra. Now both say, therefore the pasuk says, Aman zayin amud beis, 4 lines down. V'ilo ahadrekra. And had the Torah not put Asher Mitzorah back into the general grouping of karbanos, I would have thought, Hava Amina, Lemai dinafik nafik, Ulemai de lo nafik. I would have thought that halacha lemaisa, for that which, right, both say, for that which it was extracted, and for that which it wasn't extracted. Namely, what? Hachanami, hava mina eshes achud adishtaria, eshes ach dishtaria ishtari, shar arayos lo. See, I both say, what the Gemara is saying is like this. In general, when something is part of the rule and then extracted from the rule, I would have thought that lamaisa, once extracted, it remains what? Extracted, right? So we'll say, so too over here, here's what's fascinating is, we'll say, remember again, this whole sugya is all very simple. We're just trying to figure out why the Torah has the pasuk or has the drasha by achos ishto. That's all we're trying to figure out. Because what's interesting about Yibum is as follows. Yibum seems to be this same type of model, which is you have a klal. What's the klal? The klal ultimately is arayos. Arayos. Something is pulled out of arayos, or someone. Who's pulled out of arayos? Who's pulled out? Eshes ach. My brother's wife is pulled out, right? For Yibum purposes. So I will say, in general, so what happens if something is part of the klal, pulled out of the klal, and then has a chiddush applied to it? What do we do with that pulled out item? Generally, we keep it separate and distinct. The only time we put it back in the klal and potentially learn it out to other things is when the Torah puts it back. Does the Torah put Eshes Ach back into the klal of Arayos? Bepashtos, no. If that's the case, the default would have been to assume that halacha lemaisa, the only permitted erva for Yibum is my brother's wife. But no one else should be permitted. If no one else should be permitted, then why do I need, I'm always, say it's such a good metaphor for life, right? Sometimes no matter how much traction forward I feel like I make, I realize I'm just back at square one, but it's okay. We'll say, the beauty in Yiddishkeit is it's really not about how far you get. It's just about how hard you try. And that's the most important thing, because sometimes when I'm back to square one, I feel like all of my efforts have been an exercise in futility, and chas v'shalom, I don't get schar for the amount of, for the length of the journey, right, or for the amount of area I traverse. I get schar for the amount of effort I put in. So I'm back at square one, but I feel great. So we'll say, okay, so I'll say, but we are kind of back to square one. So now listen to this. But you have to admit, the journey is fascinating. I'll say also, Gemara like this, where we're learning about so many different exegetical principles, it's just fascinating to see. So I'll say, now I'm going to take you on a wild journey to an incredible case. So I'll say, rather again, I would have thought as follows. I will say, so the Gemara is not telling me, I'm going to tell you why I need the limud, ultimately again, from achos ishto. Because I would have thought as follows. Tisi b'mematzinu me'eshes ach. I would learn from a mematzinu. What's a mematzinu? Ma eshes ach miyavma ach achos ishto tisyabeim. So we'll say, what's a mematzinu? Mematzinu almost means like a common denominator. I would have said like this, what's a common denominator? We'll say, Eshes Ach is an erva. And yet what? You're allowed to do what? Yibum. So what does that teach me? What's the rule? What's the rule that the Torah is making? An erva is permitted in Yibum. Okay, by the way, sounds so simple and it makes so much sense, right? That's the mematzinu. Mematzinu is probably a better word than common denominator, but commonality, a common theme, right? Literally, mematzinu means what have I found, right? What's unique about Eishesach? Whatever Eishesach is an erva, yet the Torah says I'm permitted to go ahead and perform yibum. So too, what I would learn from that is any situation where halacha l'maisa there is an erva, yibum is permitted. To which the Gemara says, "Come on, that's ridiculous." Midami hasam chad isura hacha trei isuri. Well, so here's the problem. But it's very interesting. By my brother's wife, there's only one isser. There's only one isser. What's the one isser? My brother's wife. Listen to this. By my wife's sister, who's now also the Yevama, there's two isurim. What are the two isurim? Number one, she's my wife's sister. Number two, she's my brother's wife. Right? Because remember again, the case of Achos Ishto that we're talking about over here, remember, there's the pasuk that says you can't marry your wife's sister. And then what we're focusing on is the drasha of Aleha Aleh, the Gzer Shava from Achos Ishto to Yibum, which teaches me I can't do Yibum with my sister-in-law, who is also my wife's sister. So the Rebbe says, the Gemara wants to suggest, I don't understand, why can't you just use a mamas, common denominator, and just say, just like in a regular case of Yibum, my brother's wife, she's an erva, but she's permitted, so too any case of erva is permitted. And therefore I could go ahead and do Yibum, even with my sister-in-law, who's also my wife's sister. To which the Gemara says, no, because it's a simple, I'll tell you why it's just an erroneous argument. My regular sister-in-law is one isser. My wife's sister, who's also my brother's wife, is what? Two isurim. Hacha trei isuri. So what would you have thought? Hoel v'ishtari. I might have thought that what? Well, we'll say, maybe what we say is like this. Once Yibum is permitted, then what? Everything should be permitted. I was about to say, once you have the concept of Yibum, and Yibum is enough, this is fascinating, and Yibum is enough to permit the prohibition of brother's wife, then what? It should be enough to permit any other isser that is upon this woman as well. So I'll say, Hol v'ishtri means once it's mutter, it's totally mutter. So I'll say, by the way, this is incredible. So what we're saying over here is, once you tell me already that it's permitted for me to marry my brother's widow, right, which is a chiddush by itself, once that's permitted, then no matter how many, I would have thought, no matter how many layers of isser she has upon her, it should still be permitted, right? So okay, happens to be now that in addition to being my brother's wife, she's also what? My wife's sister. Fine. But once it's permitted to do yibum, whole ishtri means once it's mutter, the heter should set aside as many layers of isra as there are. But now watch this. How do we know that we have this concept? How do we know there's a concept like this of whole ishtri? How do we know there's a concept that once something is permitted, it's permitted? Where does this concept come from? So I will say this is an incredible case. Watch this. Tisanya. Mitzorah shechal shmini shelo be'erev Pesach. I will say this is such a great case. Very, very quickly. Or at least we'll start it today. Right? Very quickly. You have a mitzorah, right? The person with saras. So what happens with the person with saras? Yes, saras. Saras has a 7-day purification process. Right? At the end of 7 days, day number 8, he goes ahead and he brings a carbon. That's day number 8. So Rabbi says, so remember, so you have your mitzorah now, shechal shmini shel be'erev Pesach. So his 8th day of purification. Now, by the way, also another piece to this is, a mitzorah, when he is tamei, is sent out of all 3 camps, right? Machane Shechina, Machane Levia, Machane Yisrael. Which means a mitzorah who is tamei is even pushed outside of Yerushalayim. After his 7 days of purification, he's permitted to come back in, even into he's permitted to come back into the camp, right? Even before he's brought his karbanos. So on day number 8, he brings his karbanos. Now watch this. Mitzorah shechal shmini shel be'erev Pesach. If you have a mitzorah whose 8th day fell out on erev Pesach, okay. So now good news. What's the good news? He'll bring his carbon erev Pesach on the 8th day, or he'll bring his carbon on his 8th day erev Pesach, and then he'll be able to bring his carbon Pesach, and he'll be ready to take carbon Pesach with Klal Yisrael. V'ra'a kari bo bayom. Now we'll say, now watch this. And then he has a seminal emission. Now we'll say, what's the halacha with a seminal emission? So remember again, you go to the mikvah, but remember you're tummy until when? Until that night. So we'll say, here's the problem. A Baal Kari is not permitted to come into the mikdash. The problem is, we're going to see, the mitzorah for his purification has to come up to Shar Nikanor, has to come into that gate from the courtyard into the Kodesh. So how could he come from the court? So on one hand, he has to come to Shar Nikanor in order to be able to achieve his purification, but now he's a Balkari. Watch this. Amru Chachamim, Afapi Shein Tvul Yom Achar Nichnas. Even though normally a Tvul Yom, a person went to the mikvah by day but has to wait until nightfall, which is a Balkari, to become tar. Even though normally a Tvul Yom cannot enter into the mikdash, Ze Nichnas. Ultimately, again, this mitzvah is permitted to enter. Why? Mutav Shiyavo Asay Sheyesh Bo Kares the Yitcha Asay Shein Bo Kares. Ultimately, again, we'll say why. We'll just finish quickly. Why? Because halacha lemaisa, let an asay that has kares, that's a reference to Karban Pesach, right? Let an asay that has kares come and set aside an asay that doesn't have kares. So we'll say the asay that has kares is failure to do Pesach. The asay that doesn't have kares is ultimately, again, the idea that a Baal Keri or Tvul Yom should not come into the mikdash. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, Dvar Torah, afilu asay lespe. The truth is, Rabbi say, for a Baal Keri, a Tvul Yom, not to come into the mikdash is not even an asay. Shene Emar, Vayamod Yoshafat Bekal Yehuda L'fnei Chatzar Chadasha. Right, Yoshafat stood before the Kal Yehuda and the new Chatzar. My Chatzar Chadasha, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shechidshu Badvarim. It was the Chatzar in which they went and they introduced novel ideas, namely what? Va'amru Tvulom Lo Yikanis LeMachane Levia. That a Tvul Yom should not enter into Machane Levia. I'll say Machane Levia would include the Chatzar and the steps up to Shar Nikanor. Va'amra Ula Matam. Hoil v'huter l'tzaraso, huter l'kario. They will say ultimately again, and what's the reason? Again, essentially what we say for the Mitzorah is like this. Once the Mitzorah, see Rabbi, it's a chiddush that a Mitzorah who has not yet offered up his karbanos to begin with is permitted to do what? Walk up, this says Rabbi, remember again, if you're entering into the Beis HaMikdash, which we should be zocher to do B'hei Rabbi Yameinu, if you enter into the, what we call the Ezras Nashim, or the Chatzar, if you keep walking straight, you walk up a series of 12 steps, takes you to a big golden door. That first gate, that's Shar Nikanor. That's where the Mitzorah stands for the blood applications for his thumbs and his big toes. Rabbi said, truth is, the Mitzorah shouldn't really be able to come into Shar Nikanor because he's Mechusar Kippurim. He starts to bring his karbanos. So yet, there's an incredible chiddush. He's permitted to come because he has to come there for his blood application. So essentially, what do we say? If the Mitzorah becomes a Baal Keri on day number 8, which also happens to be Erev Pesach, we let him go ahead and what? We let him go ahead and come to Shar Nikanor for the blood applications. How could we do that? Hoil v'ishtaria, ishtaria. Because once it's permitted for him to come for his blood applications, we permit him to come even though what? He's a Tvul Yom. Even though technically speaking he's a Baal Keri, went to the mikvah, but still needs Harav Shemesh. This is an illustration of the principle. Once something has been permitted, it's what? Permitted in totality. Just to wrap this up, therefore what the Gemara wants to suggest is why don't we apply this same concept by Yibum? And why don't we just say by Yibum, here's how it works. Once you're permitting a forbidden relationship, then what? Permit everything. Permit everything. In other words, you were already matir in our eyes. You were matir in ereva. You took a relationship that was prohibited and you made it permitted. Once you did that, then any erva ultimately should be permitted for yibum purposes. Rabbi say, I'm going to leave you on this cliffhanger, and then Me'eretz Hashem will continue tomorrow. Shkoach. Chevra back in Baltimore, wonderful to see all of you. And shkoach to everyone. Again, Chevra on Zoom. Mamash, a lot of Jews learning Torah together. Great Schuss learning Torah. Have a great day, everyone. Yeah, I forgot to...